All right, I want to walk through this exercise that I gave in an email recently about responsibility, abstraction, and behavior. I want to show how getting specific about these three things, one leads to the next. So responsibility leads to abstraction, leads to behavior, and specifically responsibility and abstraction together define your behavior. But getting specific on them leads to clearly articulatable behavior, which leads to clearly uh, testable code, easily testable code. If you know exactly what your code is supposed to do, it becomes a lot easier to test it when you say it out loud. It kind of sounds obvious, right? So I'm going to use this component on the left is sort of our before, and on the right is our after. Don't panic. It looks like a lot of code. It's really not. But on the left, what you'll see is a pretty standard pattern for, say, fetching a user profile from an API and displaying it. So we're using use state and use effect in React. Um, in our effect, we're using fetch. We're fetching off the API given our user ID as a prop to our profile component. And then that fetch action sets the user, you can see here, sets the user with the response onto as a state value and then renders it out. So if I were to define responsibility, abstraction, and behavior for these things, the responsibility is that it fetches a user profile from the API and displays that profile to the viewer. The abstraction is the concrete API that is presented and the mental model that accompanies that. So it is I can say in my abstraction that this is a React component. Oops. Put the cursor where I want it. React component. That's a known abstraction, right? A React component, it presents an abstraction we're familiar with. It takes a user ID as a prop and displays the profile for that user asynchronously. So I can take these two things and define behavior for them, where when X happens, I expect to see Y. So behavior are your concrete, like, if this then that statements. So when I provide a user ID to the component, I expect to see the rendered profile. But the problem here is that also, what happens if the API returns 404? We should display something that we haven't addressed here. What happens when it returns 500? We should probably display something else. What happens when product comes back and says, we actually want this to be an interactive form that the user can update their profile and send a request back? And you start to jam all these things into one component, right? And these sort of combinatorial uh, possibilities of functionality make your code spaghetti, right? And brittle, untestable spaghetti that it gets scary to touch. So let's look instead at the code on the right, where I've started to extract this out into subcomponents with more clearly defined responsibilities. So the thing is, the very first smell that I see here is when we say the responsibility fetches user profile from API and displays profile to viewer. You right there, that's a smell. If it's doing two things, you probably need to split it up. If it's responsible for two different things, it is going to grow in complexity in ways that are untenable. So what I've done here, what that usually ends up with is at least three objects, the two things on either side of the and one thing to orchestrate them. So that's what I've done on the right side here, which is I've created a separate hook. This is a custom React hook whose responsibility is simply fetching the user profile from the API by ID. That is a single responsibility. The communication with the API is one responsibility. And there's a whole bunch of complexity right there, right? Because that request can go any number of ways. It can return 400, it can return 404, it can return 500. Like those are probably the more common ones. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong. It can time out, it can do all kinds of things. So you want to like encapsulate that responsibility right there into one thing. So what I've got here, this is by no means full featured, but we've got the responsibility is that it fetches the user profile from API by user ID. The abstraction is that it is a React hook. It takes a user ID, and then returns variables representing the state of the request itself. So we've got variables representing fetching, fetching, whether we've resolved to a user or whether we've gotten an error from our request. So our behavior, if we take responsibility and abstraction, the behavior can now be very clearly articulated. Given a user ID, it will initiate a request to the API. It will set fetching to true. If the request returns 200, then we set fetching to false, and the user will be the returned profile object. If the request returns non-200, then we set fetching to false and set the error to response object. These become really clear test cases, right? And so then what we've got now, having extracted that into its own testable component that is responsible for this one piece of functionality, now you have your profile container that says the responsibility is now to selectively display static components based on the state of the profile request. One responsibility, its job is to look at the profile request and display an appropriate component based on what is going on with that request to the profile. So the abstraction is that it is a React component taking in a user ID as a prop and rendering the appropriate subcomponent. The abstraction is actually pretty similar to what it was before, but because we've pulled out the logic for the request, it becomes a lot more straightforward again to test. And we can mock, this is sort of out of scope of this video, but it becomes much easier to test these because we can mock all of these things because the only logic here is based on these things that we get back, these variables that we get back from our hook, what do we display? So if setup becomes onerous, then you can mock all these things. There's actually a lot more to mocking and mocking strategy than that. It's not really just about setup being difficult. There are reasons to mock, but I can get into that in another video. But but now then all of these components are really just static components, and static components don't really need much testing, right? These are just display components. So by pulling these two things apart, by teasing apart these two responsibilities, we've created much clearer test cases for our components. We've created much more obvious places to put code as this code grows, right? So when we start to expand, when product comes to you with new feature ideas or refinements or whatever, it becomes much clearer where you're going to put new features and functionality because you have defined responsibilities for each of these. And eventually, of course, this will probably be broken down more. It will become more complex and be broken down into further subcomponents with more specific responsibilities that themselves have their own unit tests. But again, all of that is to make sure that you're working with clearly defined building blocks, not big blobs of mud that you're just kind of like shaping up and pushing up against a wall and hoping that they hold. So I hope this was useful, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.